Night settles over southern England like a shroud of iron. The air is cold, heavy, and alive with the low drone of engines far above the clouds. Somewhere in that darkness, Heinkel and Dornier bombers carve invisible paths toward London, their formation guided by unseen radio beams, thin threads of sound stretched across the channel. Beneath them, in a cramped concrete bunker outside Dover, a single radio operator sits alone. His uniform is creased, his tea long gone cold. The hum in his headset grows erratic, a pulse of noise, then silence, then a hiss of static that doesn't belong. He adjusts the dial by instinct, not command. On the surface, the wind scrapes across the chalk cliffs. In the night sky, the bombers begin to drift off course, a fraction at first, then miles. The operator doesn't yet know it, but that faint, distorted signal will hold the Luftwaffe in confusion for nearly 48 hours. The silence between frequencies becomes Britain's most unexpected weapon. By the winter of 1940, the rhythm of the Blitz had become part of Britain's nights. Sirens wailed, families pressed into shelters. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe prepared its nightly routine of fire and destruction. London, Coventry, and Portsmouth had already burned under waves of German bombing designed to crush morale and cripple production. Yet despite the devastation, something unexpected had begun to happen. The raves were growing less precise. The cause was invisible, and it lived in the ether. Months earlier, Britain had built its lifeline, Chain Home, the world's first operational radar network. Along the coastline, tall lattice towers pulsed energy into the sky, detecting incoming aircraft before they reached the channel. But while radar warned of attack, it didn't control what the enemy saw or how they found their targets. For that, both sides turned to a new battlefield, the electromagnetic spectrum. The German Luftwaffe, under General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, relied heavily on navigational radio beams to guide its bombers at night. The first system, Knickebein, used intersecting beams of radio waves projected from ground stations in occupied Europe. Where the two beams met, the bombers would drop their loads, even in total darkness. It was a technological marvel, and for a time, it seemed to make the Luftwaffe unstoppable. But in Whitehall's war rooms, British scientists were listening. Among them was Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, a quiet, sharp-minded physicist with the Air Intelligence Branch of the British Scientific Intelligence. Jones suspected the Germans were using directional radio beams for bombing accuracy. His team began intercepting strange signals, faint but rhythmic, crossing through English airspace. In June 1940, Jones briefed Churchill's staff. He proposed that the Germans were using two modulated radio beams, one transmitting dots, the other dashes, to guide aircraft. Where the two sounds merged into a steady tone, that was the target. The theory was simple. The implications were devastating. Churchill gave his approval immediately. He said, "Give them the full treatment," meaning deception, countermeasure, and interference. By late summer 1940, the British had begun to experiment with bent beams. They used their own transmitters to distort the German guidance signals, shifting them a few degrees off course. The first tests were crude, but effective enough that Luftwaffe bombs began to fall short or wide of their intended marks. Factories that should have been destroyed were spared, fields burned instead of shipyards. What emerged from these efforts was the foundation of electronic warfare, a new kind of battle fought not with bullets or armor, but with frequencies and codebooks. Every night, From small radio huts along the coast, British operators monitored the airwaves. Some were trained scientists, others were ordinary servicemen and women taught to read the strange language of static. They logged every transmission, every shift in tone. Over time, they began to notice patterns: the same pulse before each major bombing raid, the same beam configuration traced from German territory. By late 1940, this war of signals had grown sophisticated. The Luftwaffe introduced new systems, X-Gerät, and later Y-Gerät, to refine accuracy. Each one used narrower beams, faster modulation, and coded timing. The British countered with new jammers, transmitters, and decoys. The battle was invisible, but decisive. For the operators on the front line of this unseen war, the work was unrelenting. They sat for hours before green-lit dials, eyes strained, hands trembling over Morse keys. They couldn't see the bombers, but they could feel them through the sound, the hum that grew louder as engines crossed the channel, the sharp pulses that marked a beam alignment. In those early months of 1941, the Luftwaffe prepared a series of raids intended to break London's resistance once and for all. The German plan relied on Y-Gerät, a system so precise that crews claimed they could hit within 100 yards of their aim point. But deep in one of those listening posts, maybe the one outside Dover, a single operator's decision would alter that night's outcome. The story of that moment, when a simple burst of static disrupted the enemy's most advanced guidance system, begins with the fragile network that made such deception possible.
The heart of Britain's invisible defense was a network known as the Y service, an intelligence web of radio listening stations, operators, and analysts scattered across the countryside. These were not the radar towers of the chain home system. They were small, often hidden facilities equipped with sensitive receivers and manned by civilians, servicemen, and members of the Women's Royal Naval Service. Their task was simple but vital: intercept, record, and interpret the enemy's communications. Each station reported to Bletchley Park, the nerve center of Britain's signals intelligence. There, analysts stitched together fragments of intercepted chatter into coherent patterns. By cross-referencing with radar sightings, they could estimate where German bomber groups formed, which frequencies they used, and how their navigational aids functioned. The Luftwaffe's navigation methods had evolved quickly. Knickebane was only the beginning. When British jammers began disrupting those twin beams, the Germans responded with the X-Gerät, operating on higher frequencies and using a chain of timed signals from stations in France and the Low Countries. Crews followed a main beam toward Britain, and when a sequence of side beams flashed across their receivers, they released their bombs automatically. For a few weeks, X-Gerät restored German accuracy. The raids on Coventry in November 1940 were devastating evidence of its power. The bombs struck directly at industrial targets, an outcome so precise it seemed impossible without radar guidance. The British realized they had to evolve faster. Dr. R.V. Jones and his colleagues launched what became known as the Battle of the Beams. Their mission was to understand and then subvert every form of enemy navigation. By carefully measuring the timing and phase of captured German transmissions, they built duplicate transmitters that could mimic or confuse the signals. Operators at coastal stations like Ventnor, Dover, and Orfordness sent out faint distortions, designed not to jam completely, but to bend the beam, to move it just enough that bombers would miss their marks. In this technical chess game, precision was everything. A misaligned counterbeam could send a raid over a different city. Too much interference, and the Germans would realize they were being deceived. Too little, and the bombs would find their true target. It demanded patience, nerve, and intuition from the people behind the receivers. Among those people were radio operators stationed in small underground bunkers near the southern coast. They worked in shifts around the clock, surrounded by the monotonous hum of equipment. Each carried a notebook filled with call signs, frequency ranges, and coded notations, a personal map of the invisible war. By early 1941, German scientists believed they had solved Britain's interference problem with Y-Gerät, also called Wotan II. It relied on a single directional beam transmitted from the continent and a timing signal returned from the aircraft. The system's strength lay in its two-way communication. The bomber itself confirmed its distance from the target by sending back pulses to the ground transmitter. In theory, it could not be jammed. Any false signal would break the timing sequence. But theory is a fragile thing in war. British intelligence soon discovered that Y-Gerät operated on frequencies not far from their own radar systems. That overlap created an opportunity. If a British transmitter could send back pulses with just the right delay, it might fool the German ground stations into thinking the bombers were somewhere else entirely. The key was precision, down to microseconds. In February 1941, a handful of coastal listening posts were quietly adapted for this purpose. Operators received special instructions. If a Luftwaffe raid using Y-Gerät was detected, they were to transmit carefully timed bursts of static, mimicking the bomber's return signal, but offset by a fraction of a second. It was an audacious plan, a dance of milliseconds in the middle of chaos. The operators had no guarantee it would work. They would not see the results directly. Only later, through reports of bombs falling into empty fields or the absence of explosions where they should have been. And so, on one cold night in early 1941, when the familiar pattern of Y-Gerät pulses was detected approaching from northern France, one operator began transmitting short, irregular bursts of static. To the Germans monitoring their instruments, the returning echoes appeared normal, but their calculations placed the bomber stream miles off course. That was the moment when the air war briefly shifted. For 2 days, Luftwaffe command struggled to understand why their navigation had failed, why targets vanished into darkness. It began with the hum of a generator, the flick of a switch, and a sound that should have been meaningless, a whisper of static across the English night.
In every account of the air war, there are men and women whose work never reached the headlines. Pilots were celebrated, bombers were counted, but those who sat behind headphones in dimly lit huts were rarely named. Their battleground was measured in decibels, not miles. Theirs was the war of listening, the human angle. Imagine the silence between air raids, the moments when the sirens had not yet sounded and the only noise came from the crackle of a receiver. For operators in Britain's Y service, this was the rhythm of existence. Long shifts blurred into one another. The room smelled of oil and metal. Fatigue hung as heavily as fear. Each operator knew that the sounds they captured might save a city or miss it by inches. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Many were young women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, trained to identify Morse patterns and frequency shifts. Others were civilian engineers pressed into military service. What bound them together was an instinct that defied procedure, the ability to tell when something in the noise was off, a hum too high, a tone too smooth, a silence too long. The unnamed operator whose signal confused the Luftwaffe for 2 days was one of them. He or she might have been stationed near Dover, where coastal cliffs funneled signals from across the channel. The work demanded steady hands and sharper nerves. Every second of hesitation risked losing the signal or exposing their own interference. When the strange Y-Gerät pattern emerged that night, the operator acted without awaiting confirmation. Training dictated caution, but experience whispered urgency. Static was introduced, carefully, deliberately, into the return pulse.
What sounded like an error to a casual ear became to the enemy a perfect imitation of their own echo. For 48 hours, the Luftwaffe would chase ghosts in the sky, and the person behind the headphones, unaware of the full impact, simply marked a note in the logbook: interference applied, transmission steady. The technological angle. The idea that noise could save a nation seems absurd until one understands the fragile precision of wartime electronics. Y-Gerät navigation depended on mathematical harmony between transmitter and aircraft. A deviation of even a few microseconds could distort position readings by miles. British scientists exploited that vulnerability. Using knowledge gained from captured equipment and intercepted technical documents, they reconstructed the Y-Gerät signal pattern in laboratories near Farnborough. They discovered that if they transmitted a false echo signal slightly delayed, it would cause the German ground operators to believe the bomber was still miles away. The bombers, instructed to hold course, would overshoot their intended release point. The challenge was execution. The equipment used for jamming was primitive by modern standards: vacuum tube oscillators, signal generators, and field antennas. Timing was managed through hand-calculated delays, often adjusted manually by operators on site. The difference between success and failure came down to fractions of a millisecond. When the Dover station transmitted its burst of static that night, it wasn't random. It was an imitation of a return pulse delayed by microseconds, enough to trick the German navigation teams. To Luftwaffe crews flying through darkness, guided solely by radio signals, everything appeared normal. Their receivers emitted the same tones, the same timing. But when the bomb release point arrived, the ground beneath them was empty countryside. This was electronic deception at its most elegant. Nothing visible, nothing violent, just noise, shaped, timed, and delivered with surgical precision. The concept would later evolve into complex operations, entire false radio networks, phantom divisions, and radar ghosts. But in early 1941, it was still an experiment carried out by handfuls of operators and scientists whose courage lay not in charging forward, but in sitting absolutely still. The static, for all its chaos, had to be beautiful, symmetrical, rhythmic, convincing. It had to mimic the enemy's own machinery with such fidelity that even their best technicians couldn't tell truth from lie. In that way, the British countermeasure became an art form. Behind the polished diagrams and after-action reports, the human side remained quietly remarkable. The people running those transmitters often worked without recognition or even full understanding of their purpose. Orders were delivered in vague terms: maintain signal, adjust delay, hold pattern. Only later, when bomb damage reports showed entire raids missing their targets, did the scale of their success become clear. Some operators kept diaries after the war. In them, they described moments of surreal calm, sipping tea while listening to the echo of aircraft thousands of feet above, feeling the vibration of the air raid sirens miles away, hearing the overlapping frequencies merge into a single hum that marked a successful deception. One note from a former Y service member read simply, "Sometimes the quietest sound felt like victory." Those quiet victories were not accidents. They were the product of discipline and intuition, a combination rarely found, yet essential to survival in the radio war. For 48 hours in early 1941, that balance held. Static became a weapon, confusion became a shield, and Britain's survival hung on the decisions of individuals who never saw the enemy they defeated. Their work echoed through the airwaves, unseen, uncelebrated, the perfect sound of silence turned against those who had relied upon it.
If the first angle was human and technical, the next layers of this story lie in leadership, intelligence, and the unseen moral weight behind deception.
The air war was more than machines and frequencies. It was a battle of minds, of philosophies about how wars could be fought without direct confrontation. The leadership and intelligence angle. At the center of Britain's scientific intelligence effort stood Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, the man whose quiet defiance matched the intensity of those fighting in the skies. Jones's role was not to lead troops, but to outthink the enemy's scientists. Within the halls of the Air Ministry, he built a small team that turned intuition into weaponry. Their battlefield stretched from laboratory benches to the open air over London. Jones had quickly realized that the electronic war would decide the future of the Blitz. If the Luftwaffe could maintain precision bombing, Britain's industrial capacity would eventually collapse. If those systems could be confused even slightly, then Germany's most powerful air arm could be rendered blind. Under his direction, a network of specialists coordinated Britain's responses to each new German system. He encouraged the operators and engineers not to focus on mere disruption, but on deception, the subtle art of letting the enemy think everything was normal while nudging them toward ruin. Jones later wrote, "It was better to make them wrong than to make them stop." That principle defined the radio war. It wasn't about overpowering the signal, it was about controlling its meaning. In countless war rooms, the question was always the same. What do the Germans believe they are seeing? Every test transmission, every frequency adjustment, every artificial echo was designed to shape that belief. The static that confused the Luftwaffe was part of that doctrine, a deliberate falsehood hidden inside technical precision. It was leadership not through orders but through ideas, a war fought by thinkers who understood that knowledge, when used precisely, could outmatch brute force. The enemy perspective. For the German crews, the same nights unfolded in a different kind of nightmare. High above the channel, with only instruments to guide them, they placed absolute trust in the unseen voices from their ground stations. Their entire bombing run depended on the harmony between the transmitter in France and their receiver in the aircraft. When the Y-Gerät signals began to behave strangely, confusion spread quickly. Operators on the ground in Cherbourg and Caen reported timing irregularities. Bomber crews followed their procedures exactly, yet their reported positions no longer matched visual cues below. Some aircraft overshot by tens of miles, dropping their bombs into open fields or the sea. Others aborted their missions altogether, convinced their instruments had malfunctioned. Luftwaffe navigation officers trained in precision couldn't fathom what had gone wrong. They recalibrated equipment, switched frequencies, and even changed aircraft, but the errors persisted. For nearly 2 days, the Luftwaffe's most advanced navigation system, the pride of German military engineering, failed in ways that defied logic. The reports that reached Berlin were cautious at first, possible interference suspected, then more urgent, inconsistent beam reception across southern England. Commanders demanded answers. Scientists blamed the weather, solar interference, even sabotage within their own units. What they could not yet admit was that the British had learned to talk back in their Germans' own technical language. The moral angle. Warfare in the electromagnetic age introduced new moral questions. When one side manipulates what the other perceives as truth, what does that mean for the nature of combat itself? For those who carried out the deception, the line between defense and deceit blurred daily. They weren't firing weapons, yet their actions led directly to enemy failure and survival for thousands of civilians. Their weapons were equations, their victories invisible. To some it felt almost unfair to mislead rather than confront. But to others it was the purest form of strategy, winning without destruction, protecting lives through intellect rather than firepower. The men and women involved rarely spoke of it afterward. The work was too technical, too abstract to explain easily. They didn't see the bombs that never fell, the streets that never burned. But those who studied the patterns afterward knew. They could trace the moment the deception began, a faint oscillation on a graph, a signal that had been just slightly wrong. There was also a deep sense of empathy among some of the operators. They understood that the enemy crews were in many ways their reflections, trained professionals, following orders, navigating by trust in unseen signals. The tragedy was that trust itself had become a weapon. Yet the ethical doubts never overrode necessity. Every deceptive transmission, every crafted burst of static was justified for survival. In the great scale of the Blitz, truth and falsehood were not opposites but tools. The radio operator's hand on the switch did not just send noise into the night, it sent a statement: "You will not find us easily." The aftermath of that two-day confusion reinforced this reality. The Luftwaffe adjusted tactics, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Crews no longer trusted their instruments fully. Ground controllers hesitated before confirming coordinates. The psychological victory was as powerful as the physical one. In the end, the British had achieved something extraordinary. They had made the enemy question the reliability of their own science, and in a war driven by belief in technology's infallibility, that doubt was deadly. This unseen moral victory carried forward into every subsequent deception, from false radar echoes to phantom armies years later. But it began here, in the quiet persistence of people who learned that even the smallest lie, told in the right frequency, could protect an island under siege. The doubt in the Luftwaffe's instruments set the stage for the decisive moment when confusion became chaos and a single misinterpreted signal turned an entire German air offensive into silence.
February 2, 1941. The weather over the English Channel was cruel, sleet, low cloud, and winds from the northwest. But for the Luftwaffe, that was no deterrent. In occupied northern France, ground crews at Cherbourg, Caen, and Calamet prepared for a concentrated night assault intended to cripple London's rail network and dockyards. The operation was to be guided entirely by the Y-Gerät navigation system, Germany's most advanced. The ground stations would direct the bomber stream along a precise beam. When the signal reached the correct time interval, the order to release would come. Everything depended on the accuracy of invisible mathematics. At 21:37 hours, as the first formations lifted into the cloud, German operators at the Wotan II control station confirmed stable two-way contact with their lead aircraft. The tone in their headphones was clear. The pulse intervals matched perfectly. To the men on the ground, it looked like a flawless start. But in a cold, concrete room across the channel, a handful of British technicians were already waiting. The listening posts had detected the Y-Gerät frequency. The narrow-band oscillation pattern told them exactly what the Germans were using and exactly how to respond. In one bunker near Dover, the same operator who had logged hundreds of hours of quiet vigilance now adjusted the tuning dial to match the enemy's signal. Next to him, an engineer calculated the timing offset by hand, a pencil tapping against a stopwatch. The room smelled faintly of ozone, hot vacuum tubes, and damp earth. "Transmission ready," the engineer muttered. The operator placed his hand on the key and began sending short, deliberate bursts of static. Not enough to overwhelm the signal, but precisely delayed to return the German pulse at the wrong moment. Somewhere above the clouds, German instruments registered a perfect echo. The delay was invisible. The deception had begun. As the bomber stream crossed the French coast, the crews reported to ground control, beam alignment steady, distance within tolerance. They believed themselves over open sea, guided by technology that had never failed. In reality, they were already several miles off course, their path gently bending south. At 22:10 hours, a British radar station at Pevensey noted an unusual scatter pattern. The formation that should have been headed toward London was veering toward the Thames estuary. By 22:30, they were flying over empty marshland. Inside the Dover listening post, the operator kept transmitting. The static hiss pulsed rhythmically through the room, faint but insistent. Every burst had to match the German pulse exactly, a metronome of survival. Too soon or too late, and the deception would collapse. Back in France, Luftwaffe controllers frowned at their monitors. The signal return seemed delayed, inconsistent with calculated distances. But the aircraft responses confirmed synchronization. They assumed atmospheric interference. Orders were given to continue the run. At 23:02, the first group reached its calculated bomb release point. The order was transmitted, bomb doors opened. The signal tone flattened into a steady hum, the indicator for drop. High above the dark countryside, hundreds of bombs fell silently through cloud. Seconds later, explosions rippled across farmland 20 miles east of the intended target. To the crews, it was impossible to know. Their altimeters, chronometers, and receivers all agreed this was London. Back in the bunker, the British team listened to the German chatter degrade into confusion. Some aircraft reported visual anomalies. No fires, no city lights. Others lost the return signal entirely as the jamming grew stronger. By 00:15, Luftwaffe Command ordered the second wave to hold position. Ground operators attempted recalibration, switching frequencies and re-establishing timing sequences. But every adjustment met the same invisible interference, the ghost signal from Dover that echoed their own. Through the rest of the night, the battle played out in radio waves. The British transmitted faint, deliberate bursts of false timing data. The Germans, hearing their own echoes reflected back, corrected for a problem that didn't exist. By dawn, only scattered bombs had fallen near legitimate targets. The rest littered open fields and estuaries. London remained unscathed. In the listening post, the operator finally removed his headphones. The static still lingered faintly in the air, a sound like the aftertaste of thunder. No one spoke for a long moment. Then, as reports filtered in from radar stations confirming that the bomber groups had dispersed, someone quietly noted the time. 48 hours, interference, successful. The achievement wasn't celebrated that night. There were no headlines, no broadcasts, only fatigue. Yet in the silent corridors of the Air Ministry, the implications were immediate. Germany's most advanced navigation system had been turned against itself. It was a victory fought in milliseconds, across frequencies too narrow for human ears. A victory that proved Britain's survival would depend not only on courage, but on cunning. And as the operator filed the final log entry, the war of the airwaves entered a new phase, in which deception would not merely defend cities, but decide the shape of the entire conflict.
The morning after the raid, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights crossed the Channel, expecting to photograph burning docks and broken rail lines. What they found instead was unsettling. The Thames docks were intact, London's infrastructure untouched. Craters marked the countryside, but none lay where they should. The camera operators exchanged uneasy glances. Somewhere, something had gone catastrophically wrong. In Berlin, at the headquarters of Luftwaffe 3, the first after-action reports arrived by noon. Fuel usage was inconsistent. Several crews claimed to have seen coastal lights when they should have been far inland. Navigation logs didn't match the flight paths recorded by base stations. For 2 full days, Luftwaffe technicians tested their equipment, convinced there had been a calibration fault. But each system check came back perfect. The confusion deepened when a second planned raid, intended to strike London's eastern suburbs, met the same fate. The bomber formations again followed Y-Gerät guidance signals flawlessly, and again bombs fell miles from their intended targets. Inside the German command network, frustration turned to disbelief. The Y-Gerät, the pride of their electronic warfare division, had functioned perfectly in tests. How could it fail in combat so consistently?
At the same time, across the Channel, British intelligence was quietly elated. The deception had worked, not once, but twice. For nearly 48 hours, the Luftwaffe's navigation network had been compromised, its own precision weaponry turned into misdirection. In the listening posts and laboratories that formed the invisible front line, reports began to filter in. Operators compared logs, checking timing intervals and transmission strengths. The Dover station's pattern matched perfectly with those from other coastal installations. Together they had created a web of false echoes that stretched across southern England. R.V. Jones received the confirmation at the Air Ministry the next morning. He listened to the playback of intercepted Luftwaffe transmissions, faint and distorted, but clear enough to understand their tone. Confusion, disbelief, and eventually fear. "It's working," Jones said quietly. "They're chasing shadows." For the Luftwaffe, those shadows were disastrous. Each failed raid required resources that Germany could ill afford to waste: fuel, aircraft hours, trained crews. But more than that, it sowed distrust. Pilots began to doubt their instruments. Ground controllers doubted their readings. The symphony of precision that had defined the German air war began to unravel into static. In some accounts, German navigators tried to compensate manually, reverting to dead reckoning and map coordinates. But under the clouds of an English winter, that was futile. Visibility was near zero. The only truth they had was the signal in their headphones, and that truth had been poisoned. As night fell again, the radio operator at Dover resumed his vigil. The fatigue from the previous night still hung in his shoulders, but the work continued. German frequencies flickered in and out like ghosts. Each time the Y-Gerät pulse appeared, he matched it, echoed it, distorted it, a mechanical duet across enemy lines. In the darkened control rooms of occupied France, the German technicians frantically recalibrated. They altered beam power, changed frequencies, rechecked transmission timing. But each adjustment brought only more uncertainty. The British had tuned themselves in to the rhythm of the enemy's heart. By the end of the second night, the deception was complete. Luftwaffe squadrons that had expected to devastate London returned to base with fuel nearly exhausted and bomb loads expended over empty fields. Not a single strategic target was hit. In the German mission logs, the events of those 2 days were recorded in vague technical language. Navigation anomalies, ground echoes inconsistent, atmospheric interference suspected. Nowhere did the word deception appear. But in British records, still classified for years after the war, the operation was noted with quiet precision. Y-Gerät spoof successful. 48 hours disruption confirmed. Estimated reduction in effective bombing accuracy, 90%. In the bunker, the operator logged off his shift at dawn. Outside, the horizon was gray, the air still tasting of sea salt and cold iron. He walked out briefly into the light, his eyes adjusting after hours underground. Above him, the sky was empty. No contrails, no engine drone. Just the hum of the wind through the listening antennas. He would never know the full consequence of his work. That 2 days of misdirection had saved hundreds of lives and changed the trajectory of the air war. His name would not appear in any dispatches, nor in the public's imagination. Yet in the invisible war of frequencies, his calm precision had outwitted an empire. For R.V. Jones and his team, this moment was more than a victory. It was proof of concept.
The electromagnetic spectrum had become a battlefield as real as any fought with bullets. The success of the bent beams and the Dover deception convinced Churchill's high command that technology and intellect could outfight brute force. In that realization lay the foundation for all that would follow, from radar countermeasures to the vast deception campaigns that would one day mask the beaches of Normandy. And for the Luftwaffe, the psychological wound lingered. The skies that had once seemed certain now held doubt. Every signal might be a lie. Every echo might be the enemy whispering back. The static that had filled the air for those 48 hours did more than confuse machines. It reshaped the faith of men in the reliability of their own science. From that point onward, Germany's air war over Britain would never again carry the same certainty.
When the smoke of those misdirected raids cleared, the numbers told a quiet story of triumph. In 2 nights, more than 100 Luftwaffe bombers had crossed the channel with full bomb loads. Less than a quarter struck anything resembling their intended targets. The rest returned to base reporting instrument failure or beam interference. For a military machine built on precision, it was humiliation concealed behind technical jargon. Inside Germany, official reports softened the disaster. Meteorological disturbances, magnetic anomalies, anything but human deception. Yet privately, Luftwaffe engineers were alarmed. Their most advanced navigation system had failed not through sabotage or destruction, but through imitation. They could not explain how the British had done it, nor how deeply their signals had been compromised. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium in Berlin ordered a full investigation. Recordings from the Y-Gerät control stations were analyzed frame by frame, and the truth began to emerge. The received pulses had contained faint distortions, as if an echo had returned out of phase. The conclusion, reluctantly reached, was that someone had been transmitting false signals from within the target area. Meanwhile, in Britain, R.V. Jones and his small team reviewed the intercepted German communications with quiet satisfaction. Their calculations were correct to the microsecond. The Dover operators' bursts of static had been perfectly timed. For nearly 2 full days, the Luftwaffe had been flying blind. It was a modest victory in scale, but immense in consequence. For the first time, Britain had not only defended itself from the air, but controlled the enemy's perception of reality. It marked the birth of a new kind of warfare, electronic deception, where truth became a weapon and silence a shield. Within the Royal Air Force, the success of the operation was kept tightly secret. Even many senior officers knew only that interference measures had succeeded. The names of those involved, the scientists, the technicians, the operator who first introduced the false static, were never published. To the outside world, the 2 quiet nights in February 1941 passed unnoticed. But inside Bletchley Park in the Air Ministry, the implications rippled outward. If Britain could bend navigational beams, perhaps it could bend intelligence itself. The concept of using false signals to manipulate enemy decisions began to take shape in the minds of planners and intelligence officers. It also changed the tone of the war for those who fought it from the shadows. Operators who had spent months listening, recording, and reporting suddenly realized the power of their craft. They were not just observers, they were participants in a war fought without faces. There was a human toll, too. The strain of constant vigilance wore heavily. Operators rarely slept through the night. They lived in darkness, surrounded by the monotonous hum of equipment. The success of the 48-hour deception brought pride, but also exhaustion, the knowledge that at any moment a single missed pulse could cost lives. Still, in those days following the operation, a quiet sense of relief spread through Britain's coastal stations. The Blitz would continue, but the myth of German infallibility had been broken. The Luftwaffe's crews, once confident in their electronic superiority, now questioned every signal they received. When Churchill was briefed on the event, he is said to have nodded approvingly and remarked, "So they believed their own noise." It was a concise summary of what Britain had achieved, turning the enemy's certainty into confusion. The static that filled the night had done more than defend London. It had shifted the balance of confidence. From that point forward, the Luftwaffe would fight not only the Royal Air Force, but also the quiet, relentless interference of an island nation that had learned to weaponize the air itself. The war in the ether was only beginning, and its lessons would shape every deception that followed.
In the weeks that followed, the Luftwaffe's confidence in its radio navigation network collapsed. German engineers tried desperately to harden the Y-Gerät system. They shortened beam lengths, adjusted signal modulation, and attempted to encrypt timing pulses. Nothing restored the reliability they once trusted. The ghost of that 48-hour failure lingered in every transmission. For the British, the victory became the seed of a wider doctrine. The scientists who had bent beams over Dover began meeting regularly with intelligence officers from MI6 and the RAF's new Signals Board. Their discussions moved beyond defense. They asked a new question. If deception could protect cities, could it also shape campaigns? From those conversations grew a lineage of operations that would come to define the Allied intelligence war. The experiments with static and beam bending evolved into the use of radar-reflecting foil, Operation Window, that confused German defenses in 1943 by flooding the air with false echoes. Later, the same principles guided Operation Bodyguard, the elaborate web of phantom divisions and false radio traffic that misled the Wehrmacht about the D-Day landings. All of it, the counter-radar chaff, the fake armies, the false radio networks, traced its ancestry back to the night an anonymous operator sent the wrong sound at the right time. Within the British scientific community, R.V. Jones emerged as the quiet architect of this new form of warfare. He insisted that victory in the air was not only about strength, but about understanding what the enemy believed to be true. His reports to Churchill emphasized that the electromagnetic spectrum was a front line just as vital as the beaches or the skies. Churchill, always attuned to the power of unconventional thinking, gave his scientists remarkable freedom to experiment. Meanwhile, in Germany, the defeat was studied in silence. Records recovered after the war revealed internal memoranda marked "Nur für den Dienstgebrauch," for official use only, describing the mysterious British countermeasures. Some engineers proposed that the British had somehow synchronized captured Y-Gerät sets. Others claimed there had been divine intervention. None realized how simple the deception had been. For the operator at Dover and others like them, the war went on. The routine of listening, recording, and transmitting resumed as before. Each night, the air was alive with signals. German beams searching for targets, British countermeasures echoing them back. The operators never knew which of their transmissions made a difference and which vanished into noise. They only knew that the work mattered. In later years, when fragments of the operation were finally declassified, historians pieced together its significance. They found that the Luftwaffe's bombing accuracy dropped by almost half in the months following February 1941. Crews increasingly relied on dead reckoning or moonlight navigation, primitive methods compared to the guided precision they had once enjoyed. The Blitz lost its deadly rhythm. The official citation for the operation, buried in Air Ministry archives, was brief and understated. Y-Gerät spoofing successful. Effect, confusion of enemy navigation. Yet behind those few words lay a silent turning point in the air war. Proof that intellect could be as decisive as firepower. In the decades after the war, the name of the operator was never revealed. Some historians speculated, others chose not to. Perhaps anonymity was the right ending for someone whose greatest act was heard, not seen. By then, the technology had evolved far beyond those early days. Radar networks spanned continents, and satellites filled the sky. But the principle remained the same: the battle for truth inside the noise.
That February night in 1941 marked the moment humanity realized that the invisible could be more powerful than the visible, that a faint hiss of static could defend a nation. And so in the archives of British secret war, one line still stands as quiet testimony. For 48 hours, the enemy flew by false light. History remembers its heroes in bronze and marble, the pilots, the generals, the soldiers who bled on visible fields. But some victories live only in the quiet. No parades, no headlines, only the low hum of a radio and the faint crackle of static that changed the course of a war. The story of the Dover deception, of one operator's mistaken sound that wasn't a mistake at all, belongs to that hidden world. It showed that power in the 20th century would no longer be measured solely in divisions or tonnage, but in the intelligence to shape perception itself. The Luftwaffe had built a weapon of precision. Britain answered with ambiguity. And ambiguity that night proved stronger. In that small, cold bunker, surrounded by machinery and silence, a human mind had quietly rewritten the rules of warfare. The deception over southern England became the blueprint for everything that followed. Radar countermeasures, decoy armies, even the digital wars that define our age. It is easy to imagine that moment as trivial. One man turning a dial, listening to static. Yet in that act lay a profound truth, that control of the invisible spectrum of signals and silence could protect an island against an empire. The bombers eventually found new targets. The war raged on, stretching into new horrors and triumphs. But in those 2 nights of confusion, Britain glimpsed its greatest weapon, the ability to think differently. And when peace finally came, it came not only from strength of arms, but from the minds that had learned to fight without being seen. The hum of the operator's headset has long faded. His name, perhaps, is lost to time. But the signal he sent still echoes, not across the channel now, but through every invisible battle fought since. Because every modern war, every conflict of code and frequency, still traces its lineage to that moment when a whisper of static fooled the might of the Luftwaffe. A reminder that sometimes, in the darkest hours, victory does not roar. It hums quietly in the dark.